So something just exploded on Canada's political map, and not the kind Ottawa wanted.
Canada could be on this brink of a political earthquake. In the West, something once dismissed as fringe is now a fully mapped out plan that could redraw the country's borders.
But here's the thing. The West has heard it all before. Every time Alberta pushes back, Ottawa talks like separation is the apocalypse. They're like, oh no, you're killing all of us!
Alberta, Saskatchewan, and even parts of British Columbia are talking about breaking away. Not in vague terms, but with binding referendums, new laws, and a clear timeline.
The point is simple. The West doesn't just have the political will, it has the economic muscle. And that's the nightmare scenario for Ottawa.
For the first time in a generation, the question isn't if separation could happen, but how soon? What's driving this movement? And what happens if they succeed? It appears Canada is facing one of its most significant political shifts in decades. In a coordinated move, leaders from Alberta, Saskatchewan, and some parts of British Columbia have announced plans that could change the country's political map. These plans include holding binding referendums on whether to separate from Canada. This isn't simply political theater or symbolic talk. The proposals are tied to concrete timelines, drafted legislation, and an outline for what regional governance could look like if the votes pass. For the first time in modern history, these Western provinces are moving beyond rhetoric and into an organized legal process aimed at possible independence. The announcements included specific steps for creating provisional regional governments that would operate separately from Ottawa in core areas such as taxation, policing, infrastructure, and the management of natural resources. While there have been independence movements in Canada before, this marks one of the most structured and coordinated challenges to Canadian unity since the Quebec referendums of 1980 and 1995. The leaders involved say this is about more than protest. They argue it is a response to years of political and economic frustration. The proposal sets a clear time frame. Residents in Alberta could be voting within the next 12 to 18 months on whether to leave the Canadian Federation entirely. Saskatchewan is expected to follow a similar path, and while British Columbia as a whole is unlikely to join, some interior and northern communities in the province have expressed interest in pursuing greater autonomy. The reaction from Ottawa was swift. Federal officials have warned that any move toward separation would trigger a constitutional crisis and could lead to serious economic instability. Prime Minister Mark Carney has described the plans as dangerous and irresponsible, pointing to legal precedents that make unilateral separation a complex and uncertain process. However, leaders in the West say they are no longer willing to wait for change from Ottawa, claiming that the current federal system does not respect their priorities or give them enough control over their resources. The seriousness of the current push is partly due to legislative changes within Alberta. The province recently passed Bill 54, which lowers the number of signatures required to trigger a citizen-led referendum. Previously, campaigns needed roughly 600,000 verified signatures to force a vote. Under the new law, that number is closer to 170,000. This is about 5% of Alberta's population and is widely considered achievable for well-organized groups such as the Alberta Prosperity Project, which has already begun efforts to mobilize support. This reduced threshold transforms what was once a long-shot political idea into something that could realistically appear on a provincial ballot. The legislation also formalizes the process, making it a legal requirement for the government to hold a vote once the signature threshold is met. That means this is not just political posturing. It is a legislated mechanism with the potential to set a referendum in motion in the near future. Saskatchewan, while not yet introducing equivalent legislation, is closely watching Alberta's moves. Officials there have made it clear that if Alberta proceeds with a vote and builds momentum, Saskatchewan will consider adopting similar laws. The discussions in British Columbia are more limited. Most of the province's population, especially in its urban centers, tends to support federal policies, but some rural and resource-dependent areas are showing interest in aligning with Alberta and Saskatchewan's approach. This shift from talk to tangible action marks a clear turning point for the Western independence movement, often referred to as WEXIT. for years, WEXIT was dismissed as a fringe movement without significant public backing. Polls rarely showed more than a quarter of the population in favor, and major political parties avoided associating with it. But recent federal policies on energy, taxation, and environmental regulation have reignited tensions and increased interest in self-governance. Federal decisions in recent years have played a role in this renewed push. Policies such as carbon pricing, net zero emissions targets, and the cancellation of major pipeline projects have been controversial in resource-rich provinces. Many in Alberta and Saskatchewan see these policies as harmful to their economies and argue that they are imposed without adequate regional input. The proposed referendums are framed by their supporters as a way to take back decision-making power and protect regional economic interests. The plan presented by Alberta and Saskatchewan is more detailed than any previous attempt at Western separation. It not only outlines a referendum, but also proposes interim governance structures. These would allow the provinces to begin managing their own taxation systems, law enforcement, and resource development independently of Ottawa if voters choose to separate. Supporters say this would prevent a long period of uncertainty between a yes vote and actual independence. Ottawa's position, based on Supreme Court rulings, is that a province cannot unilaterally declare independence. Instead, a clear referendum result in favor of separation would require both the province and the federal government to enter into negotiations on the terms of separation. However, even the act of holding a binding vote could have political and economic consequences. It could influence investor confidence, affect trade discussions, and shift the balance of power within Canadian politics, even if the vote fails. Public opinion on the issue remains divided. Current polling suggests that around 30% of Albertans and 25% of Saskatchewan residents would support independence if a referendum were held today. While these numbers fall short of a majority, they represent a solid foundation for a campaign, especially when combined with the potential turnout from disengaged or infrequent voters. Referendums in other countries, such as the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom, have shown that these voters can have a decisive impact. For independence advocates, the coming year represents a rare opportunity. The combination of organized leadership, a legal pathway, and ongoing dissatisfaction with Ottawa creates conditions that are more favorable than at any point in recent history. The next steps involve building public support, gathering the required signatures, and preparing for the legal challenges that would follow a successful vote. Critics, however, warn that separation could create serious economic and political problems. They point to the complexities of dividing national infrastructure, negotiating new trade agreements, and determining how debt and assets would be split. There are also unresolved issues around Indigenous land rights, as many First Nations have agreements directly with the federal government. Any move toward independence would have to address these agreements, which could add significant legal and ethical challenges to the process. One of the earliest and most significant turning points came in 1980, when the federal government under Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau introduced the National Energy Program. This policy placed limits on Alberta's oil revenues and redirected a significant portion of those earnings to other parts of the country. For many in Alberta, this confirmed a long-standing suspicion that Ottawa saw the West primarily as a source of wealth to be redistributed elsewhere. The resentment created by that policy left a lasting mark, becoming a key reference point for future disputes over resource control. In the decades that followed, Western Canada often felt disconnected from the political and economic decisions being made in the nation's capital. Even during periods of economic boom driven by oil and gas development, Alberta and Saskatchewan had limited control over major infrastructure projects. Ottawa retained authority over pipeline approvals, environmental regulations, and other resource-related policies, often implementing measures that Western leaders believed were out of step with local priorities. This feeling of being sidelined deepened in the 2000s and 2010s. Despite changes in federal leadership between Liberal and Conservative governments, Western alienation remained a constant feature of Canadian politics. For many residents, the issue was structural. The electoral weight of Ontario and Quebec, which together decide most federal elections, meant that Western preferences rarely shape the national agenda. Even when Alberta and Saskatchewan voted overwhelmingly for one party, the election outcome often favored the opposite. This created a sense of political irrelevance, as though the West's votes could never truly influence the country's direction. The WEXIT movement, short for Western Exit, began to take shape in this environment. Inspired in part by the United Kingdom's Brexit campaign, it was initially dismissed as a fringe idea without serious backing. Early polls rarely showed support above 25%, and few elected officials wanted to associate themselves with it. But events after the 2019 federal election changed the political climate. That year, the West voted overwhelmingly for the Conservative Party. Yet the result was a Liberal minority government, supported largely by voters in central and eastern Canada. Alberta and Saskatchewan ended up with almost no representation in the federal cabinet, reinforcing the belief that the Federation was structurally biased against them. At the same time, federal policies on climate change, carbon pricing, and emissions targets were becoming more ambitious. While these measures were popular in many urban centers across the country, they were often seen in the West as harmful to the resource-based economy. The cancellation of major energy projects such as the Keystone XL and Northern Gateway pipelines added to the frustration. These projects had been championed by Western leaders as vital to both economic growth and energy security, yet federal decisions effectively stopped them. It was in this context that WEXIT began to gain traction among more mainstream political voices. Local advocacy groups such as the Alberta Prosperity Project and the Alberta Independence Party started developing formal plans for how separation could work in legal and administrative terms. In Saskatchewan, provincial leaders began exploring ways to take greater control over firearms regulation and revenue collection, following models already used by Quebec. Academic discussions also became more frequent, with legal scholars examining constitutional options for a province to pursue independence. The current push for separation builds on these earlier efforts but is much more structured. Alberta's Bill 54 is a prime example. By lowering the signature threshold for triggering a referendum from about 600,000 to around 170,000, the legislation has made it significantly easier for grassroots campaigns to get a sovereignty question on the ballot. The bill also imposes a legal requirement for the government to hold a vote once that threshold is met, removing any political discretion over whether the issue should be put to the public. While Alberta has taken the lead, Saskatchewan is closely observing the situation. Officials there have not yet introduced similar legislation, but they are considering the option. If Alberta proceeds with a referendum and builds momentum, Saskatchewan is likely to follow with its own version of Bill 54, using Alberta's framework as a guide. In British Columbia, the situation is more complex. The province's urban areas, particularly Vancouver and Victoria, tend to support federal policies and are less inclined toward separation. However, there are pockets in the interior and northeast regions where sentiment for greater autonomy is stronger, especially among communities that depend on resource development. The grievances driving these movements can be grouped into three main categories: economic frustration, political alienation, and cultural division. Economically, the West produces substantial wealth through oil, gas, agriculture, and other natural resources. Yet under Canada's equalization system, much of that wealth is redistributed to provinces with less revenue-generating capacity. Critics in Alberta and Saskatchewan argue that this system effectively penalizes success, transferring billions of dollars each year to provinces such as Quebec, which has also opposed pipeline projects that could expand Western access to global markets. Politically, the structure of the federal electoral system means that Ontario and Quebec hold the majority of parliamentary seats. This concentration of political power often leaves the Western provinces on the losing side of federal elections, even when their vote is nearly unanimous in one direction. As a result, national policies are frequently shaped without significant input from Western voices, leading to a perception of chronic exclusion. the cultural divide is less tangible but just as important. Many Western communities maintain more conservative values, with strong support for the energy industry, rural traditions, and skepticism toward large-scale government intervention. In contrast, much of urban Canada has embraced more progressive positions on climate change, social policy, and identity issues. These cultural differences can make national policy debates feel disconnected from the everyday realities in Alberta and Saskatchewan, adding to the sense that Ottawa's priorities are out of touch with Western concerns. Media coverage has also played a role. National outlets based in Toronto or Montreal often portray WEXIT supporters as extremists, focusing on the more outspoken or controversial elements of the movement. This portrayal can deepen the divide, as many Westerners feel their concerns are not represented fairly in national discussions. What sets the current independence push apart from earlier efforts is its focus on building a concrete process. This is not just about rallying public opinion or sending a political message. The aim is to create a legal and administrative path that could, if successful, lead to actual separation. That includes not only triggering referendums, but also developing interim governance structures to manage taxation, infrastructure, law enforcement, and resource policy during a potential transition. The federal government, meanwhile, has made it clear that it considers unilateral separation unconstitutional. Citing the Supreme Court's 1998 ruling on Quebec, Ottawa maintains that a clear referendum result would require both federal and provincial governments to negotiate the terms of separation. Even so, the existence of a legislated referendum process increases political pressure. If a majority voted in favor of independence, the federal government would face significant pressure to engage in negotiations, regardless of its legal arguments. For many supporters of WEXIT, this pressure is part of the goal. Even if full independence is not achieved, the threat of separation could push Ottawa to make concessions on resource control, taxation, or other areas of provincial autonomy. For opponents, however, the strategy is risky, potentially destabilizing the economy and creating uncertainty that could deter investment. From a political perspective, Ottawa has taken a firm stance against the idea of unilateral independence. Prime Minister Mark Carney and other federal leaders have been clear that a province cannot simply declare itself sovereign without negotiations. Their position is supported by the 1998 Supreme Court of Canada ruling on Quebec's attempt at separation. That decision made two key points. First, a clear majority vote in a referendum on independence would carry significant political weight. Second, it would obligate both the provincial and federal governments to negotiate in good faith, but it would not automatically grant a province the right to leave. In practical terms, this means even a successful yes vote in Alberta or Saskatchewan would be the start of a complex and potentially lengthy negotiation process. Despite this, the binding nature of Alberta's planned referendum has raised concerns in Ottawa. While the federal government could challenge aspects of the process in court, a clear result in favor of independence would create political pressure that could be difficult to ignore. In this sense, the referendum is as much a political tool as it is a legal mechanism. Even if the federal government maintains control over the final outcome, the act of holding a vote and potentially winning it would shift the national conversation and might force Ottawa to consider policy changes aimed at addressing Western grievances. Economic impacts are one of the biggest areas of concern for both sides. Federal officials warn that separation could lead to instability in investment, trade, and financial markets. The uncertainty over which laws and regulations would apply during a transition period could make businesses hesitate to commit to new projects in Alberta or Saskatchewan. There is also the question of how to divide national debt and assets. Separating provinces would need to negotiate their share of Canada's liabilities, while also seeking agreements on infrastructure such as railways, highways, and pipelines that cross provincial and international borders. WEXIT supporters argue that these economic risks are outweighed by the potential benefits of independence. They point out that a sovereign Alberta could set its own tax policies, sign its own trade agreements, and develop natural resources without federal restrictions. In their view, the ability to directly manage the oil and gas sector, agriculture, and other key industries would give the province greater economic flexibility and competitiveness. Supporters also believe that independence could allow for faster and more targeted infrastructure development, tailored to the needs of the region, rather than the priorities of the federal government. One of the most complex and sensitive issues in any separation scenario is the question of Indigenous land rights. Many First Nations in Alberta and Saskatchewan have treaties with the Crown, which means their agreements are with the federal government rather than the provinces. Independence would raise immediate legal and ethical questions about how those treaties would be honored, who would be responsible for their obligations, and how Indigenous governance would be recognized in a new political framework. To date, neither provincial leaders nor independence groups have provided detailed answers to these questions, but they would be unavoidable in any negotiation process. Internationally, a successful referendum in Alberta or Saskatchewan would almost certainly attract global attention. Canada is a G7 country and a long-standing member of NATO, with a reputation for political stability. The separation of one or more provinces would be unprecedented in modern Canadian history and could have ripple effects in trade agreements, security partnerships, and diplomatic relationships. The United States, Canada's largest trading partner, has so far stayed out of the debate, but it would likely be drawn in quickly if the process advanced. Cross-border pipelines, energy exports, and environmental policies are all areas where U.S.-Canada cooperation is currently essential, and a change in Alberta's political status could complicate those arrangements. The impact within Canada would also be significant. If Alberta voted to separate, Saskatchewan would almost certainly follow, given its similar economic structure and political outlook. Interior regions of British Columbia, particularly those tied to resource industries, might also seek greater autonomy or even alignment with a newly independent West. Manitoba, while often considered more centrist, could be pulled into the conversation depending on the economic and political direction of its neighbors. In this way, the independence movement could create a chain reaction that challenges the current model of Canadian federalism. One factor that has caught the attention of both supporters and opponents of separation is the potential role of disengaged voters. Political analysts have noted that referendums often draw out people who rarely participate in regular elections. In the United Kingdom, this was a key factor in the Brexit vote, where turnout from irregular voters helped tip the balance in favor of leaving the European Union. WEXIT advocates believe a similar dynamic could work in their favor, arguing that many Albertans and Saskatchewanians who feel ignored by the political system are simply waiting for a meaningful chance to express their frustration at the ballot box. The federal government faces a strategic challenge in responding to the growing movement. Treating it solely as a legal threat risks reinforcing the perception in the West that Ottawa does not take their concerns seriously. On the other hand, engaging directly with the idea of separation carries political risks for federal leaders, particularly in other parts of the country, where the focus is on maintaining national unity. The question for Ottawa is whether to address the underlying grievances with concrete policy changes, or to rely on legal arguments and political pressure to contain the movement. Regardless of the outcome, the next 12 to 18 months are likely to be a defining period for Canada. If the signature threshold for a referendum is reached in Alberta, the province's government has committed to putting the question of independence to a binding vote. Saskatchewan could follow soon after. Even if the result is a no, the process will have drawn unprecedented attention to the issue of Western autonomy and may reshape the relationship between the provinces and the federal government. For investors and businesses, this period of uncertainty will be closely watched. Companies in the oil, gas, and agriculture sectors, which are central to Alberta and Saskatchewan's economies, may begin making contingency plans in case of a shift in regulatory or tax frameworks. Financial institutions will be monitoring the situation for signs of instability that could affect credit ratings or capital flows. While some see the threat of separation as a risk, Others view it as a potential opportunity for new markets and business models in an independent Western economy. In the broader context of Canadian history, the WEXIT movement represents both continuity and change. Western alienation has been a recurring theme for decades, but the combination of legal mechanisms, organized leadership, and political momentum gives the current push a weight it has not had before. Even if separation does not happen, the mere possibility has forced a national conversation about how the Federation works and whether its current structure meets the needs of all its regions. The ultimate outcome will depend on a complex mix of political will, public opinion, legal interpretation, and economic realities. What is clear is that the West is no longer content to simply voice its dissatisfaction. It has created a path, however challenging, that could lead to a fundamental redefinition of its place in the country. Whether that path ends in greater autonomy within Canada or full independence, the decisions made in the coming months will have lasting effects on the future of the Federation.